Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. Anger is a basic human emotion, and none of us is immune. Even the most level-headed of us can lose our cool. We can experience road rage, anger at injustice, and we can experience it as we grieve. Yet as natural as anger is, it can be extremely harmful. It can cause damage to our bodies, hurt our relationships, and it can hijack our brains, causing us to act impulsively with potentially disastrous outcomes. But what exactly is anger? Why does it exist? And given how big the stakes are for this inevitable emotion, what are some tips for dealing with it? These questions and so many more will be covered in this interview with internationally recognized anger expert, Dr. Ryan Martin. Ryan is a professor of psychology and an associate dean at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. He's also the author of a book I absolutely love called Why We Get Mad. He has a well-watched TED Talk on anger, and he draws on over 20 years of research and study of this misunderstood emotion. So please listen in as Ryan and I have a lively talk on anger and how to best deal with it. Dr. Ryan Martin, who has asked me to call him Ryan, welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you so much. I am really happy to be here.
Oh, I've been enjoying geeking out to your work, and I consider you a fellow geek. And by geek, I mean that you have that quality of intrinsically pursuing psychology for the sake of pursuing it because you love it. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I would argue that I am motivated by curiosity in potentially weird and obsessive ways at times, where I get very much hung up on an idea and I don't feel good until I've followed that idea to its conclusion. Truthfully, some of these things, they don't have a conclusion, right? I just keep going and going and going. And that's where I am with anger, and it's where I end up with a lot of things.
What a great fortune it is that you decided to double down on anger, because it's such an important and frequently misunderstood emotion. It can be destructive, it can be instructive, it can even be quite protective. But before we really unpack this, how did you get into anger?
I would say that there are a couple of different ways. There was this running joke when I was growing up about the quote unquote Martin temper, right? My last name's Martin. And this idea that temper sort of ran through my family, particularly the men in my family. And I sort of grew up with it. It was all around me. You know, I went to college planning on being a math teacher, which is in some ways pretty far away from where I ended up, but in other ways, not far away at all. And it was when I discovered psychology, back to the curiosity thing, that I really fell in love with it. And I was sort of obsessed with it for a while. And when I was there, though, I started working at a shelter for, and I'm not crazy about this term, but we at the time used the language at-risk youth.
Sure.
Right? These were adolescents who were in some trouble. And they were at this shelter for a gajillion different reasons, including they had quote unquote failed out of foster care placements. They had some trouble with the law. Honestly, one time we had a resident who was there because mom was having surgery and there was no place else for him to go. And so tons of reasons. But one of the things I noticed is that one of the most salient problems that a lot of these kids were having was difficulty controlling and regulating their anger. And I was studying psychology. I knew at that time I wanted to be a counseling psychologist. I went to graduate school with the plan to study counseling psych and to start thinking about, well, maybe anger is what I'm interested in. I will admit, years later, I think one of the things I realized is that these kids were right to be angry. They had a lot to be angry about. The world had treated them very unfairly, and they were experiencing a lot of injustice in their life. And it doesn't change that they needed to find better strategies, but it does explain why it was so difficult in ways that I didn't fully understand. In graduate school, I was very fortunate frankly lucky to get to work with a guy named Dr. Eric Dahlin at the University of Southern Mississippi. He was a new faculty member when I was starting there, and his area was anger. And from that point on, I just really became, again, sort of obsessed with this, wanting to just research it and all the time.
And it's amazing because if we could get a handle on anger in general, whether it's the so-called at-risk youth, and I would actually argue that pretty much all youth are at risk because of the fact that they don't have many trips around the sun of life experience. They've got a lot of cocktails of hormones going through them, and their prefrontals are not yet fully formed, making them perfect Trojan warriors, but perhaps at risk.
Right.
But the anger thing, just in a flash of anger between the stimulus and the response of that life-changing act could transpire. So I'm thinking, what a great thing to double down on, because if we could get a better handle on anger, wow, wouldn't that change things in every which way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have seen instances of that, life-changing moments time and time again that resulted from poorly controlled anger. And I think sometimes we put too much of the onus on the person who expresses that anger. And one of the things I like to do is think about it, or try and think about it a little more holistically. Think about the environments we create, the spaces we are in, how we're taking care of ourselves, because all of those things factor in to these moments. And if we can make changes to all of those different things, we can have a positive impact on people's lives.
I couldn't agree more. One of the things that you and I share in common, in addition to having a Y chromosome and being human, is that we've both been triggered in the seat of our car while we were driving and ended up noticing, oh my gosh, I've just flipped somebody off. And there was an aftermath for both of us, which in my case, and I think we were probably younger than we are now, and we're wiser now as a result of having done this. Like you, I was also chased, and it almost ended very badly. But that trigger response, you've mentioned that the car itself is almost the optimal petri dish for anger to occur. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why is the car so suited for anger?
Yeah, I mean, this is like this is a great segue, because when we think about the environments we are in and create, we have created an environment in driving and in the car that is perfectly constructed to feel rage, and for a lot of reasons. And so one of those is that by definition, you are on your way someplace. So you have a goal in mind. And one of the causes of anger is goal blocking, right? It's when things get in your way. And so you can be slowed down by stoplights, by traffic, by bad weather, by other drivers. All these other factors can interfere in your ability to achieve your goal. But also, we're surrounded by these anonymous other drivers, and we've set up a scenario where, yes, there are written rules of the road, but those rules aren't really followed by many people. In fact, we all tend to have some of our own kind of unwritten rules for the road about how we should behave, what the speed limit is, how you handle, one of my favorite examples as a dad is the school drop-off line and how we handle that and what the sort of norms are there. And when other people aren't using the same norms as us, when other people aren't using the same unwritten rules, we get frustrated in ways that maybe we should or maybe we shouldn't, depending on what they're doing. Add to that, on top of everything else, driving is dangerous. And many of us have been doing it long enough that it's easy to forget that it's dangerous. But that elevated tension state that we're experiencing, it just puts us at a higher risk. And so it's all of this, the anonymity from the other people, all of these things are just sort of perfectly constructed to lead to these angry incidents.
Yeah, I love that. And in your TED Talk, you so beautifully describe various things that make people angry, including roundabouts, including that line of water that we get on the counter. Some of them get really specific, but let's unpack it. What is anger? How would you define it?
I'm glad you asked, because I think this is where some of those misunderstandings come from. Anger is an emotional state, much like fear, much like sadness, joy, curiosity, right? These are emotional states. And anger specifically is associated with having been wronged, experiencing injustice of some sort, or having your goals blocked, something interfering in what you're trying to achieve. Most of the time, in fact, sometimes we actually define anger as being the emotional experience associated with wanting to lash out. That we ultimately do want, our instinct is to reach out or lash out either verbally or physically and harm another person. And so now we don't have to act on that. And when we do act on that, that's a different thing. That's what we call aggression. It's that intention to hurt someone or something, either verbally or physically. But those behaviors are separate from that emotional experience. The emotion is the feeling state with the physiological arousal, some of the cognitions and thoughts we have. Those are ultimately the emotional state.
Absolutely. In spite of the fact that you and I both have studied psychology extensively, and many people, when they meet us perhaps at a cocktail party, or perhaps if they engage us for psychotherapy, may imagine, oh, well, this guy's got it all figured out and probably doesn't get really angry. And yet we are, as I mentioned earlier, in spite of our doctorates, we're human. And in spite of all of our schooling, again, human. So we both experience anger. All it takes is for me to be in a car. And that George Carlin line, he made a joke many years ago, is that everybody else on the road is either an idiot or an asshole. I don't know if you remember that joke, but
I know of the joke, and there's something accurate about that. I mean, I want to say the joke has to do with speed limits, that the person in front of you is an idiot if they're not going as fast as you want them to go. The person behind you is reckless, right? They're
reckless.
Crazy.
Yeah, that's right.
Because they want to go faster than you are. And we all believe that whatever speed we're going is the correct speed.
And so that kind of conforms with a bias that all of us carry around. And I was wondering if you could unpack that bias and how it is indicated, or with the implications of that bias as it pertains to anger.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of broaden this out a little bit as we talk about it. But, one of the reasons we get angry is because we experience these events in our lives, these what I call provocations, but sometimes not even that. They're just stimuli, these things in our lives, and we interpret them. We decide what they mean to us. And that's what we call appraisal. So something happens and I decide, is this good or bad? Is this unjust? And so on. There are a couple different types of appraisals that we know are associated with anger. And so one we've already talked about are those other directed shoulds, or what we sometimes call demandingness, right? This belief that other people should sort of serve us, that whatever they're doing isn't as important as what we're doing, and that sort of approach to things. There's also what we call misattributing causation, which is when we assume people did things on purpose when it was an accident. Yep. And so it's like a car cuts me off on the road and I say, oh, we did that on purpose, when it might have just been an accident, and still scary, still a problem, but maybe not as bad. There's inflammatory labeling, the George Carlin thing. We label people in these negative ways. And once we do that, we're responding to that label. But another real biggie is catastrophizing. We blow things way out of proportion sometimes, and we decide this is the worst thing that's ever happened. It's going to ruin my day, my week, my life, my career, who knows. And once we do that, these things that happen, they feel like we can't cope anymore. This is just too terrible to deal with. And I think that one of the most important things, back to your thing about whether or not we get angry, I would actually argue that I'm a relatively angry person. I don't yell and scream, and I don't hit things, and I'm not typically mean to people, but I actually do look around and see a lot of injustice that I find frustrating and even flat out exhausting and angering. It's really, for me, it's not that I think people shouldn't be angry. It's that I want people to be angry for the right reasons and at the right time, and then express it in some of the best possible ways. And that's where I think a lot of people sort of struggle with anger, is sort of when they're getting angry and why they're getting angry and how they deal with it when they do.
Absolutely. And we will definitely be unpacking the how to handle this inevitability that we will become angry a little bit more. But before we do that, I just find that whole idea of this attribution bias of, well, it must be because they didn't care and they're totally acting outside the contract, the unwritten contract that you don't cut somebody off. And in reality, they might actually have just gotten some horrible news about their beloved pet, and they were just spacing out. It may have nothing to do with the violation of said contract. So I think that whole idea of that bias that we all can experience in our solipsistic existences, and the idea of catastrophizing, oh, such a good one. Actually, come to think of it, I'd like for you to go there. You tell it was a horrible experience for you, but tell one of the greatest stories about being a master's level, person about to have your break at a large professional international convention to deliver a talk, and you were held up in traffic and you began to catastrophize. Could you describe some of the
Yes.
thoughts that went through your head as you were driving to that convention.
Yeah, I was on my way to the American Psychological Association conference in Chicago. At the time, my brother lived about an hour outside of Chicago. So I was staying with him. I was a grad student. I was trying to save money. And I got up. I thought I left myself plenty of time. I ended up getting caught in terrible traffic from some pretty bad thunderstorms that had happened the night before that had closed roads and things like that. And I really sat in the car and just kind of lost my mind there for a little while. I was screaming at the heavens. I was mad at the drivers in front of me. I was just beside myself. And a big part of what I was doing is what you just described. It was catastrophizing. I was thinking about how this was going to ruin my career. This was going to be so bad for me. And my advisor wasn't even going to be there, but he was going to find out about it. He was going to be furious with me. I was mad that I'd driven to Chicago for no reason because I was going to miss my session.
Totally.
And so the funny thing about it, and I can't remember if I tell this story in this part of the story in the book or not, but the funny thing about it is that part of the reason I was really anxious is that there was a guy there that I was really excited to meet named Jerry Deffenbacher, and he was my advisor's advisor. And I get there and I'm late and I'm there and I'm all flustered. And I said, I'm so embarrassed. I can't believe I'm late. And he says, I just got here 5 minutes ago. Something like that. Like he had suffered the same consequence as me and he totally understood. And so I think it really signals or speaks to the fact that sometimes these catastrophic events are way worse in our own minds than they are in other people's minds. And I'm probably other than that, I wrote about it. I'm probably the only person on earth who remembers this story and remembers how this was going to ruin my career.
I related to that so much, so many times running late to a thing. I've imagined that my death would be impending. And I think about Mark Twain's great quote, which I'll paraphrase, something to the spirit of, I've lived through thousands of catastrophes, most of which never happened. And that was one of yours. And you were very quickly disabused of the idea that horror was imminent. And in fact, it had a comedic ending to it. And it served as a great anecdote. And by the way, yes, you did include that part in the book about him.
I thought I did.
That he had just arrived. And it was so relatable, that story. And all of the phenomena that occur. And as you mentioned, the car literally has all of the planets aligned for being just the best and worst place for anger. Let's talk about the reason that anger exists and how, if it were used at its best, it might actually serve us.
This is an important thing about all emotions, and especially these really basic emotions that we experience more or less from the time we're born or shortly after birth. And that is that they exist as knowledge systems, right? They exist to give us information. So when I feel sad, it is one of the ways my brain alerts me to the fact that I've lost something. When I'm scared, it's one of the ways my brain alerts me to the fact that I'm in danger. And for listeners, if you've seen the movie Inside Out, there's a very nice metaphor here for kind of how emotions work. Really, really good way to teach kids about feelings. And anger's purpose is to alert us to injustice, or goal blocking is to tell us we've been wronged in some way. And it does even more than that, in that by kicking off our fight or flight system, it energizes us to confront that injustice. So it lets us know, hey, there's a thing, you've been wronged, and then here's the energy you need to fight back. And that's good for us. And it exists in us because of our evolutionary history. It provided our ancestors, human and non-human, with this reliable advantage. And the problem we have now, though, is that what we sort of learned to do, or what our nature might want us to do, to lash out, is not the way to get things done anymore, right? And so yelling, screaming, hitting, violent approaches, things like that, they are illegal and cruel. And so finding other ways to channel that energy into something productive and something pro-social and helpful.
Yeah. So how might that be done? Since anger is so basic and resides, if you look at the brain, in a lower structure than the part of the brain that's responsible for handling judgment and our higher executive functions, how do we best attend to that part of ourselves so that we can bring on that very important, perhaps even life or death information without it actually causing harm?
So a couple ways to do this, and none of them are easy. And that's the thing that I would want listeners to know, is that the approaches we're talking about right now, they require work. And to be honest, a lot of that work you do not when you're angry, you do it after the fact. And what I mean is that taking time to reflect on your angry episodes and what you did and what you could have done and where you should have found the opportunity to pause and take a little break. That's a really important part of this process. And they're exceedingly hard to do in the moment until you've had some practice with it. Because what happens is you might think like, oh, there's no way I can stop myself right now. But eventually you hit a point where you realize, yikes, I'm going down a road I shouldn't go. I should stop and try and recalibrate. But the more you practice, the more you think about it, the more you reflect on it, the more you're able to move that point up to the part right early on when you're getting angry, where you're able to stop moments after you've gotten mad and you're able to respond a little bit and say, what is the best course of action right now? What is it I should be doing right now to get me where I want to go? And rarely is that saying to yell and scream and hit someone. It's usually
the middle finger.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if ever there was a lesson I learned that day in a Mississippi Walmart parking lot, do not extend the middle finger. Very, very little good can come from it.
It's such a great story. I hope you folks read the book. This is one of those books that not only makes you smarter, but it is just such a pleasure to read, including all of the anecdotes that you share.
Thank you.
For sure. Let's go back there for a second, because one of the things you're describing is something that we're not prone to do, and that is to engage in a post-game analysis of something that's pleasant or yucky.
Yes.
And how important it is that we actually do the post-game analysis of that yucky thing for the sake of better relationships, for job advancement, for actually a host of physiological and other mental health benefits that we can unpack later. But what might be kind of a directive to guide someone to having that post-game analysis of anger gone bad?
And that's a really great question. And part of what I love about it is, I think it's really interesting because I think there are people out there who do that post-game analysis all the time, but they end up being really fixated on when they're having that post-game analysis. They end up really fixated on, they said this to me, I can't believe they did that. It's what we call rumination. And I'm a heavy ruminator. I totally understand this phenomenon. I think that shifting the focus of that post-game analysis to, okay, what might I have done? How might I have evoked some of this from the other person? How might I have behaved differently and responded differently to some of the things they said? How might I have maybe manipulated the situation in a healthy way? To continue with the post-game analysis metaphor, it'd be like if a coach walked into a room and said, we're going to watch game tape, but just of the other team.
That's such a great one. That is one of the best I've ever heard.
So, well, good. Thank you. So what I think that I'm trying to do is like shift that focus to, okay, so what is it we can do? Let's watch our own game tape and talk about how we can react or even initiate things differently. And that's something that people are not used to. And frankly, this is also something that takes hard work and takes skill, in the sense that when we're emotional, and even afterwards, when we're sort of emotional about the incident that already happened, we tend to be really defensive. And it's hard for us to really reflect on our own behavior. And so some of what needs to happen is we need to have that space from the incident to give ourselves time to look back on it with that critical eye and be okay with that. And it takes confidence, and it takes hard work, and it takes a willingness, as you said, to unpack something unpleasant.
And to introspect and to really examine the only party we can control to any extent. You know, I live in Silicon Valley and I have an iPhone, and I have a very fraught relationship with Siri. She just doesn't quite listen to me. So I called one of my engineering friends and I said, Siri and I are having a relationship problem. And he very wisely just said to me, Adam, who is the more flexible member of the relationship? And I think about what you're saying, and I think it's apropos of this conversation. Like, we can't control the other, but maybe we can control ourselves.
And that's the thing. I think sometimes when I start talking about, hey, think about what you may have done to contribute to this, I think on the surface, it feels sort of disempowering. It's almost like you're like, wait, what? I did this? Well, you're blaming, or victim blaming is almost.
Totally.
But what I want people to know is that it's actually really empowering because you're the person you can change in this scenario. And so there is like essentially when you start thinking about your own behavior and your own thoughts in these situations, you're really thinking about how you can take some control back.
I find myself thinking about Fred Luskin's work. He's the director of the forgiveness program at Stanford and a former guest on the show who wrote Forgive for Good. And he basically describes the process of forgiving as the decision to stop carrying around resentment because, let's face it, it's not doing us any good. Even if the resentment is well warranted, it needs to be discharged so that we're not carrying this, coursing through our veins all day because it will inhibit our relationships. I'm curious to know also about how your relationship was with your father, especially you shared some stuff that, the Martin anger is a thing, the Martin temper, and that growing up, in spite of the fact that your father sounds like he's overall a really cool guy, he had an anger thing. And it causes us to kind of walk on eggshells. There's just so many side effects to anger, even if it's come by honestly.
Yeah, people know that anger damages relationships. That's well known, right? But usually when people think about that, they imagine scenarios where you say something in a fit of rage that you wish you could take back and you hurt someone's feelings or it turns into a physical fight, or something like that. And what they don't necessarily think about is sometimes when the relationship damage is a little more indirect. And so you mentioned my dad. My dad was someone who had a temper, and it was very rarely directed at me, but it was still scary to be around. I found myself, like you said, walking on eggshells, sort of worrying that I might do something or say something, or worse yet, that someone else would. And so would he get upset at a waiter for something they did? Or when we're driving, if somebody cut him off, would he escalate the situation from there? And so it ended up being that I often felt a little bit uncomfortable around him for that concern. I was worried that he would kind of lose his temper at some point.
Totally. I remember walking with a friend in South Boston and some guy gave out, some type of call on him. And my friend was like, let's do this. Man, it's not worth a trip to the ER. And so I was concerned. I was like, this is so not worth it. Do not engage. Let's talk about anger stimulants, though, because you actually cite certain things in the book, including experiments where there is a gun in view. This experiment blew my mind. I was not familiar with it. Could you share that piece?
I've been thinking about it a lot lately, actually, but it's known in psychology as the weapons effect. And there's been two really interesting versions of it. One is the original, happened in a lab someplace, and I'm forgetting the year, regrettably, but basically what happened, people came in to do a study and the researcher would do a thing where when they sat down in the lab, there would be either sporting equipment sitting on the desk, like a racquetball racket or something like that, or there would be a gun sitting on the desk. And he would say, oh, I can't believe the previous researcher left this stuff here. Sorry. And then I don't even know if he took it away or just sort of pushed it off to the side, like, hey, ignore that. Yes, still in view. And so then they did the study. And what they found is if the gun was present, they were more likely to react with aggression to various prompts. And so it's basically a priming effect that happens, that the existence of this weapon, just having it there, led to this level of this increased aggression. And then a few decades later, a researcher named Brad Bushman did this same thing, but in a driving simulator. And so same exact scenario, only the gun was left on the seat of this very cool driving simulator they have at Ohio State. And same scenario, they said the same thing, even like, oops, somebody left that there, just ignore it. And then look to see how they reacted. And indeed, same thing happened. They were more aggressive, more dangerous driving if the gun was present. So it's essentially a cue that increases or exacerbates aggression.
I thought that was incredible. And the study's been replicated, and that really lends itself to its credibility. Let's talk about chronic anger. I've actually come across, let me know if this is incorrect, that people who have anger problems, so to speak, chronic anger problems are really just, that's one of their main primary food groups in life, that they can actually incur loss in their hippocampi. This is the part of the brain that's responsible for memory, they can lose up to 25% of hippocampal function. And if we think about memory and its role in our identities, it's so central. And so, I mean, what's at stake here is everything from memory loss to, of course, cardiological issues to, GI symptoms and sleep, and a whole host of other problems can come about. I'm wondering, could you share what's at stake if we handle anger badly, especially chronically?
So I am fascinated and not surprised by the hippocampal research you decided. I'm not familiar with it. As I said, I'm a curious guy. So I will be looking it up as soon as we're done here. But yes, we know, and we've known for a long time, that there are health consequences associated with anger. And of course, we also know that this research is exceedingly complicated because of their interactions with all sorts of other aspects of our life. But most notably are the cardiovascular consequences, right? It's associated with heart disease and stroke and high blood pressure and a host of things in that area. Where things get muddled and complicated is whether or not that's due to some related personality traits that tend to come with it. Competitiveness, for instance, is also associated with that. The type A syndrome in general is associated with that. That's part of where we know a lot of this. We also know that angry people might engage in a lot of less healthy behaviors. And so they might be more likely to smoke. They're probably more likely to drink. Some of what happens on the road, by the way, isn't aggression. It's just risky driving. They just drive more dangerously. So all of that can play a role. So muscle tension, chronic headaches, all of these problems often associated with chronic unresolved anger.
For sure. And you cited many ways for us to deal with our anger, including what you just said with the post-game analysis. You also talked a bit about cognitive processing. And I thought that was a really important intervention. I was wondering if you could share that and or any of the strategies that seem to be most helpful to put into practice to help us channel that anger.
Getting back to something we started with, the holistic thinking here. When I think about why people get angry, there's really three kind of converging elements here. There's whatever that provocation is. There is the mood state we're in at the time of the provocation. So are we hungry? Are we sleepy? Are we stressed? Whatever. And then there's how we think about it. And we can intervene in any of those areas, right? We can actually think about the provocations we either intentionally or unintentionally invite into our lives. So what are the things that I wander into knowingly? Do I need to go read the comments on my cousin's Facebook post, right? Do I need to invite that into my life? And so that's one piece where we can intervene. The other is we can do a better job of taking care of ourselves. We can try and get a better night's sleep. We can manage our stress a little more effectively. We can try and eat right. We can get some exercise. A lot of things there that might put us in a better place when we experience those provocations. So we don't find ourselves hungry or sleepy. And then finally, and this is where a lot of the interventions come from, especially in the clinical and counseling realms, are exploring the thoughts we're having. So to what degree are we catastrophizing? To what degree are we misattributing causation? Are we being demanding? Are we overgeneralizing? This always happens to me. I never get what I want. So we can think about our thoughts and whether or not we need to engage in more adaptive, healthier thoughts. And I should tell you, my definition of adaptive and healthy thoughts are not ones that minimize the nature of the stressor. They're ones that kind of try and put those in as accurate a place as possible. So I'm not telling people, hey, don't catastrophize, minimize. I'm saying, let's think about what is the most realistic outcome. Is your career ruined? Probably not. Does that mean that everything's going to be fine? Maybe not. Something can be bad, but still not the worst. And so try and figure out where this thing is and then start to problem solve. And when it comes to the cognitive and sort of behavioral strategies for dealing with anger, I'm a believer that as you start to become a little more rational, one of the best things to do is to stop and think about what your desired outcome is. What do you want this situation to end with? And then how do you get there? Because what you do next can be dictated by that. If you're driving to work, for instance, and there's a car behind you and they're tailgating you because you're going too slow and they're honking and they're riding on your bumper, think about your desired outcome. What is it you want? And chances are what you really want is to get to work or to school safely. And the way to do that is not to slam on the brakes. It's not to give them the finger. It's maybe to get out of their way, let them go about their day so you can be safe. And once we start thinking about things that way, I think the things we should do in those moments become more clear to us.
Well, that's such a great point. And it speaks to one of my favorite axioms, and that is the quality of our questions determines the quality of our life. And those include self-generated questions. So it seems that one of the best reflexes that we could have in the face of anger is to ask ourselves, what is our desired outcome? And perhaps even parenthetically, I'm going to embellish a little, what would be best for all stakeholders? Maybe that piece as well. And it could involve just, like in south of Boston, when my buddy wanted to, bring it on. And I was just like, dude, this could result in a permanent limp for you or worse. Let's maybe not. What would be the best outcome? Leave and forget about it and maybe laugh about it over beer somewhere else. If at the time that's where we were headed to go share beer. I love this. Is there anything I should have asked but haven't yet?
I guess one thing I would say is when it comes to consequences, I'm an advocate that anger has all sorts of positive benefits in our lives and that there are good reasons for us to feel it and that it's an important force that we should listen to. But that said, like anything, there are all sorts of consequences associated with it when it is happening too often or when we're not managing it well or when it's too intense. And I think one thing that people might not realize, and we alluded to some of this with the nature of relationship damage and how that can look a lot of different ways, the same is true for a lot of consequences, that the health consequences can be maybe broader than people realize, that the relationship damage can be broader. I mean, we haven't even talked about a sort of online damage of relationships and the ways in which people can fracture relationships just by what they post or say online.
Anonymously or not face to face, not eye to eye.
Yep. And sometimes those relationships are damaged in ways you don't even realize, that you post something or someone posts something and you see it and you forever think about that person differently and they have no idea. So just being aware that the consequences are vast and they are significant. And final thought on that is that one of the things I think people don't realize is that the chronically angry also oftentimes experience chronic anxiety and even chronic depression because they feel guilty later on. They feel sad. They regret things they've said. And that takes a toll on them emotionally. Sometimes I think we assume that angry people are these narcissistic monsters who don't care what other people think. And that's not often true. I think a lot of times there are people who lost control and then they later end up sort of kicking themselves in a way that does a lot of damage to them personally.
Absolutely. And I think it'd be fair to say that virtually all of us experience anger. There is, I'm guessing that even Mr. Rogers, as sweet as he was on TV, for those of us who remember him, may his memory be a blessing because it is. I'm sure he experienced anger and he actually showed it. He actually showed angry face to let kids know that this was actually a normal part. My final question though, I'm telling you, Ryan, I'm so stoked that you're here. But for a moment, you're going to be wearing Gandalf the Grey's wizard robe and you're going to have the magical powers to confer upon all humanity one skill or insight that would change people's lives for the better. If you could impart or confer upon all humanity one skill or insight that would help people, what would it be? And how do you imagine it would help the individual as well as perhaps society at large?
Oh, that is a really fun question. So maybe this is too broad, but I would say emotional insight, a way of understanding not just their anger, but why they're experiencing any particular emotion and be able to sort of understand realistically what impact it's having on them and the people around them. I do believe that, and I know that our emotions influence so many of the decisions we make day in and day out, from what we have for lunch to who we vote for to what kind of job we have. And I think people are going to be healthier if they understand where those emotions are coming from.
And from one geek to another, I've been so looking forward to this, Ryan. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom so generously. Please go out and buy this book. This is going to be a standard issue at my practice. It's one of the finest things I've come across. And just thanks again, Ryan. This was a blast.
Yeah, I really appreciate all the kind words and for inviting me on the show. And this has been a great talk. Thank you.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.